Sometimes a man spends his whole life running from the past, only to find it waiting for him in the last place he'd ever look. Jedediah Crowe learned the truth the hard way. A weathered mountain man seeking peace in the Wyoming high country, Jed bought a piece of forgotten land, with an old barn the locals warned him to avoid. They spoke of strange lights flickering at night, and a darkness that changed anyone who went inside. Jed didn't believe in superstition. When he opened those barn doors, he found something buried beneath years of dust. Letters, weapons, and evidence of a massacre erased from history. A massacre tied to his own family. Now outlaws are closing in, the town's secrets are unraveling, and Jed faces an impossible choice. Bury the truth again, or bring justice to wrongs long forgotten. What was hidden in that barn worth killing for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach rattled into Coldwater Ridge on a Tuesday morning in late September, 1883, carrying dust, mail, and one passenger who looked like he'd been carved from the mountains themselves. Jedediah Crowe stepped down onto the rutted main street with the careful movement of a man whose body remembered every hard year it had lived. He was 54 years old, though his face could have passed for older or younger, depending on the light. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and eyes, but those eyes themselves were clear, a pale grey that seemed to see through things rather than at them. He wore a battered leather coat that had seen better decades, wool trousers tucked into worn boots, and a hat with a brim shaped by weather and time. His beard was mostly grey, trimmed close, and his hands bore the scars of a man who'd done hard work his entire life. But there was something else about him, something in the way he moved. Economical, aware, like a wolf in country it doesn't quite trust yet. The town of Coldwater Ridge sprawled along a single main thoroughfare with maybe 24 buildings pretending to be civilization. It had the usual offerings: a general store, a saloon, a church that looked like it had given up trying, and a sheriff's office that looked like it hadn't. The buildings were weathered pine, some with false fronts trying to look more impressive than they were. Mountains rose on three sides, pine-covered slopes climbing towards snow-touched peaks. It was beautiful country, the kind that made a man feel small and temporary. Jed collected his belongings from the stage driver, a bedroll, saddlebags, a rifle in a worn scabbard, and not much else. A man learned to travel light when he'd been traveling as long as Jed had. The driver, a leathery old fellow named Hutchins, gave him an appraising look. "You the fellow buying the Pritchard land?" Hutchins asked. "I am." Hutchins spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Good luck with that." Before Jed could ask what he meant, the driver was already climbing back onto his perch, eager to be moving. The stage pulled away, leaving Jed standing, alone on the street with his worldly possessions, and the weight of curious stares from the townspeople who'd paused in their business to examine the stranger. He made his way to the land agent's office, a narrow building sandwiched between the general store and a seamstress shop. The sign read, "Pritchard Land and Property." Inside, the air smelled of paper and tobacco smoke. A desk dominated the small room, and behind it sat a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the look of someone who'd spent his life indoors counting other people's money. "Mr. Crowe?" The man stood, extending a hand that felt like shaking paper. "Samuel Pritchard. We've corresponded." "We have." Jed shook the hand briefly. "I'm here for the deed." Pritchard's smile was nervous, like a rabbit that's heard a twig snap. "Yes, well, about that. I feel obligated to mention once more that the property, while fairly priced, does come with certain— I read your letters, Mr. Pritchard. I know what I'm buying. The barn, specifically. The locals have, well, they have opinions about it. I'm not buying their opinions. Just the land." Pritchard looked like he wanted to say more, but something in Jed's face discouraged conversation. He turned to a filing cabinet and withdrew a folder, producing a deed written in careful script. The document was standard enough. 160 acres on the northern edge of the valley, with timber rights, water access from a creek, and one structure described as barn, construction date unknown. Jed examined the deed carefully. His education had been intermittent, learned in army camps and from a mother who died when he was 12, but he could read well enough. The price was almost suspiciously low for the acreage, even out here where land was cheap. On the reverse side of the deed, someone had drawn a rough map in pencil showing the property boundaries and a small square marked barn in the northeast corner. In the margin, in different handwriting, someone had scratched what looked like a warning. Let it rest. What's this? Jed pointed to the notation. Pritchard barely glanced at it. Oh, that. Previous owner's notation, I believe. Eccentric fellow. Died last winter. Had no heirs, so the property reverted to the bank. They hired me to sell it, and no one local wanted it. Pritchard's smile became even more strained. As I mentioned, there are superstitions. The barn, you see, has a reputation. People claim to see lights there at night, hear sounds. Nonsense, of course, but country folk can be superstitious. You mentioned that. Jed counted out payment in cash, money he'd saved from years of guiding, trapping, and doing odd work across 3 territories. It represented almost everything he had, but that was all right. He didn't need much. Pritchard counted the bills twice, then signed the deed over with visible relief. It's yours, Mr. Crowe. I'll file this with the county by week's end. One more thing, Jed said. I'll need to buy supplies. Where's the best place? Mackey's General Store next door. Tell Tom I sent you. He'll treat you fair. Jed nodded and left, the deed folded in his inside coat pocket. The general store proved well stocked for a town this size. Flour, coffee, bacon, ammunition, tools. The proprietor, Tom Mackey, was a round man with a beard like a hedge and sharp eyes that didn't match his friendly manner. New in town? Mackey asked while measuring out flour. Bought the Pritchard property. The measuring stopped. The one with the barn? That's the one. Mackey's expression shifted, became guarded. You know about the barn? I know people talk about it. I don't put much stock in ghost stories. An old-timer sitting by the stove spoke up, his voice like gravel. Ain't ghosts you need to worry about, mister. It's what ghosts remember. Jed turned to look at him. The old man was ancient, skin like weathered saddle leather, eyes milky with cataracts. But there was something in his expression. Not fear exactly, but a deep unease. What do they remember? Jed asked. Things that should stay buried. The old man spat into a tin can. You seem like a decent fellow. Take some advice from someone who's been here since this was just wilderness. Stay away from that barn. Don't go in it, don't mess with it, just leave it be. Why? Because some places carry a weight. That barn carries weight enough to crush a man's soul. The old man wouldn't say more, just turned back to the stove and stared into the flames. Mackey finished preparing Jed's supplies with the efficiency of someone eager to complete the transaction. As Jed was loading his purchases, a tall man with a tin star on his vest approached from across the street. Sheriff Otis Brennan was perhaps 45, with dark hair graying at the temples and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He had the build of a man who'd been strong once and was determined to stay that way through sheer will. His eyes were cold as mountain snow. You're Crowe, the sheriff said. It wasn't a question. I am. Heard you bought the old Pritchard place. News travels fast. It's a small town. People talk. Brennan looked him over with the assessing gaze of a man used to judging threats. You planning to settle here? Planning to live quietly on my own land. That a problem, Sheriff? Depends. You a troublemaker, Crowe? I'm a man who wants to be left alone. Something flickered in Brennan's eyes. Was it relief or disappointment? Then we'll get along fine. Just stay on your property, mind your business, and we won't have issues. I don't go looking for issues, Sheriff. Brennan nodded slowly. Good, and Crowe, about that barn on your land. Best thing you could do is tear it down. Or better yet, don't go near it at all. That's the second warning I've gotten in an hour. Nobody wants to tell me why, because some things don't need explaining. They just need respecting. Brennan touched his hat brim. Welcome to Coldwater Ridge. He walked away, leaving Jed standing in the street with his supplies and a growing sense that whatever he'd bought It was more than just land. He rented a horse and wagon from the livery and headed north out of town. The road, more of a trail really, wound through pine forest and meadows, turning gold with autumn. The mountains stood silent and immense, and the only sounds were the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clop of the horse's hooves. After 3 miles, the trail forked, and Jed took the eastern branch. Another 2 miles brought him to a clearing, where a creek ran swift and cold over smooth stones. And there, at the far edge of the clearing, stood the barn. It was larger than he'd expected, built of pine logs weathered to silver grey. The roof was steep-pitched, still solid-looking despite years of weather. The doors were massive, reinforced with iron straps, and they were closed. No windows, just those great doors and the silent bulk of the structure, somehow managing to look both abandoned and inhabited at the same time. Jed sat on the wagon seat for a long moment, studying it. The old-timer's words echoed, "Some places carry weight." Looking at the barn now, silhouetted against the late afternoon sky with mountains rising behind it, Jed could almost feel what the old man meant. There was something about the structure, not supernatural, he told himself, just the accumulated atmosphere of abandonment and rumor, but his instincts, honed by decades of surviving in hard country and harder wars, whispered that maybe the rumors had roots in something real. He made camp 50 yards from the barn, near the creek, where water ran clear and cold. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Jed built a fire and made coffee. He unpacked his bedroll, but found himself watching the barn more than he watched the fire. In the gathering darkness, the structure seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No mysterious glow appeared, no sounds emerged, just silence and shadow and the solid reality of wood and iron. But Jed couldn't shake the feeling that the barn was watching him back, waiting to see what he would do. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd start building a cabin, start making this place a home. The barn could wait. He had time. But even as he thought it, lying in his bedroll with his rifle close at hand, Jed knew he was lying to himself. The barn wouldn't wait. It was already calling to him, pulling at his curiosity like a hook in flesh, and Jedediah Crowe had never been good at leaving mysteries alone. Jed spent the next 3 days working the land and deliberately avoiding the barn. He told himself he was being practical. First things first, build a shelter before winter came. He chose a spot on a slight rise with good drainage and a view of the creek. The work was familiar and satisfying, felling pines, stripping branches, notching logs. His body remembered the rhythm of honest labor, and his mind appreciated the simplicity of it. Cut, notch, stack, repeat, but every time he straightened his back to rest, his eyes found the barn. It stood there at the edge of the clearing, patient as stone, waiting. On the 4th morning, Jed woke to frost on his bedroll and accepted what he'd known since arriving. The barn wasn't just structure on his property. It was the reason he'd come here, though he hadn't understood that until now. All his life he'd been drawn to things that didn't sit right, to questions that needed answering. It had made him a good scout in the Indian Wars, made him useful in ways the army appreciated and his conscience sometimes regretted. The barn was a question, and questions don't answer themselves. He approached it in full daylight, when shadows were short and the sun was honest. The structure looked even larger up close, the logs thick as a man's torso, fitted with a skill that spoke of craftsmanship. But the doors, those massive doors, were what caught his attention. They weren't just reinforced. They were built like they were meant to keep something in, or keep something out. The chain that secured them was new, rusted only superficially. Someone had been maintaining this lock recently. Jed studied the mechanism. Simple padlock, heavy but not impossible. He could shoot it off, but that seemed disrespectful somehow. Instead, he returned to his camp and retrieved a pry bar from his tools. Sometimes the direct approach was best. The bar slipped between door and frame, and Jed applied pressure. The wood groaned. The lock held. He adjusted his angle, set his feet, and levered harder. Something in the frame cracked, and suddenly the lock broke free, chain clattering to the ground. The sound seemed too loud in the clearing silence. Jed pulled one door open. The hinges shrieked, metal on metal, high and piercing. The sound of something that hadn't moved in years finally yielding. The door swung wide, and the barn's interior yawned before him like a mouth opening. Darkness. Even with morning sun behind him, the interior was dark. Jed's eyes adjusted slowly. The smell hit him first. Old hay, dust, and something else. Something like earth and time and secrets kept too long. He stepped inside. The barn was mostly empty. Old hay lay scattered on the floor, and dust motes danced in the shafts of light that squeezed through gaps in the walls. The space was perhaps 40 feet square, with a loft overhead and support beams massive enough to hold up the roof through decades of mountain winters. Nothing supernatural, nothing frightening. Just an old building that had outlasted its purpose, but Jed's instincts were screaming. Something was wrong here. Not wrong like danger, wrong like a story that didn't match the facts. He walked the perimeter slowly, studying the walls, the floor, the way the light fell. And that's when he noticed it. The floor wasn't quite level. There was a depression in the northwest corner, subtle but definite. And the floorboards there looked newer than the rest, their weathering inconsistent with the barn's age. Jed knelt and ran his hand across the boards. They were pine like the others, but the nails were different, machine-made, not hand-forged. These boards had been replaced maybe 10 or 15 years ago. He wedged the pry bar under the edge of one board and pulled. It came up easily, too easily. Beneath it was another board, and beneath that, darkness. Someone had built a false floor. Jed's heart was beating faster now. The old, familiar feeling of being close to something important, something dangerous. He pulled up 3 more boards, creating an opening large enough to see through. Below the false floor was a cavity perhaps 3 feet deep, and in that cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, were objects. He lowered himself down, his feet finding solid earth beneath the barn's foundation. The cavity was larger than he'd thought, extending several feet in each direction. He pulled out the first bundle and brought it up into the light, the oilcloth unwrapped to reveal a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed, the ink brown with age. Jed opened the top letter carefully, the paper brittle beneath his fingers. The handwriting was educated, careful. A woman's hand. "My dearest sister," it began. "I write to you with a heavy heart and heavier fears. Marcus says, I worry for nothing that these are good people and this is good land. But the men from the mining company came again today. They were not kind. They made threats." Marcus stood firm, as is his nature, but I see the worry in his eyes when he thinks I'm not watching. The children sense it too. Even little Samuel asked me why the men were angry. The letter continued, describing daily life, but threading through it was a current of fear. It was dated August 3rd, 1867. 16 years ago, Jed set it aside and opened another. Same handwriting, dated August 10th, 1867. The threats have become more direct. They offered money again, 3 times what the land is worth, but Marcus refuses. "It's not about the money," he says. "It's about principle. We came here to build something, to make a life. We will not be driven away by bullies and thieves." "But, sister, I am frightened. There are 17 families here now, and we have built homes and planted crops and begun to create community. What will become of us if these men do not relent?" Jed felt coldness spreading through his chest. He reached back into the cavity and pulled out another bundle. This one was heavier, wrapped in different cloth, darker and stiffer. When he unwrapped it, a pistol fell into his hand. A Colt Navy revolver, old pattern, the metal pitted with rust but still recognizable. And beneath it a knife, and beneath that a small leather journal, and then his hand closed on something else. Something small and metal and cold. He brought it up into the light, a locket. Silver tarnished nearly black on a broken chain. Jed worked his thumbnail into the seam and popped it open. Inside was a photograph, the old kind, a daguerreotype. A woman young, with kind eyes and a slight smile. She was holding a child, perhaps 2 years old. The image was faded but clear enough to see their faces, to see the life in them. He turned the locket over. Engraved on the back, nearly worn smooth, were initials and a date, Sim C 1867, and beneath it, "Remember Us." MC, the letters from the woman mentioned Marcus. Marcus and his wife and their child. Remember us. Jed sat back on his heels, the locket cool in his palm. Around him the barn suddenly felt different. Not threatening, sad. Deeply, profoundly sad, like a wound that had never healed. He was reaching for the leather journal when he heard the sound. Boots on hard ground, moving fast. Jed's hand went to his hip, where his own pistol rested, and he stood smoothly, turning toward the open barn door. Sheriff Brennan stood there, silhouetted against the morning light. He wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, both wearing deputy badges that looked newly pinned. Both had their hands near their guns. "Crowe," Brennan said, his voice flat. "I thought I told you to stay away from this barn. You suggested it. I own the land. I can go where I please on my own property. Not in that barn, you can't." Brennan stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimness. He saw the pulled-up floorboards, the objects scattered around Jed. His face went hard. "What have you done?" "Found what someone hid here, letters, personal effects, old weapons." Jed held up the locket. "This belonged to someone named MC, dated 1867. You know anything about that, Sheriff?" "Put that down." Brennan's hand moved to his gun. "Put everything down and step away from it. This is my property. These are artifacts on my land. I have every right. You have no rights here." Brennan's voice was cold. "That barn is off limits. Those items are not to be disturbed. I'm ordering you, as sheriff of this county, to leave them and leave this barn immediately." Jed didn't move. "Why? What happened here that you don't want anyone to know about?" "Last warning, Crowe." The deputies had their hands on their guns now. Jed calculated odds. 3 to 1, poor position, poor light. He could probably drop 1, maybe 2, but he'd die in the process. And more importantly, he didn't yet understand what he'd found. Dead men don't get answers. He set the locket down carefully on one of the floorboards and raised his hands slowly. "All right, I'm leaving." "Smart," Brennan gestured to his deputies. "Collect all of it. Everything he pulled out. Bring it to my office. Sheriff, these are historical artifacts. They belong to the county now. Evidence in an ongoing investigation." "Investigation of what?" Brennan's smile was cold. "Trespassing and disturbing a protected site. You're lucky I'm not arresting you right now, Crowe, but I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you one more chance. Pack your things, sell the land back to Pritchard and leave Coldwater Ridge today. And if I don't, then accidents happen. Men living alone in remote places, they disappear sometimes. Fall down ravines, get lost in the woods, encounter unfriendly wildlife. This is dangerous country, Crowe, especially for men who don't listen to good advice." The threat was delivered calmly, almost conversationally. But Jed had heard enough threats in his life to recognize one that was meant. He walked past Brennan and out into the sunlight, his hands still raised. The sheriff's deputies followed him, rifles now drawn. Jed kept walking until he reached his camp by the creek. Behind him, he could hear movement in the barn, the deputies collecting everything he'd found. Brennan emerged last, carrying the bundle of letters. He stood at the barn door and looked across the clearing at Jed. "You've got until sundown. After that, I can't guarantee your safety." Then he and his men mounted horses that had been tied out of sight and rode away, taking with them every piece of evidence Jed had discovered. Jed stood alone in his camp, watching them disappear into the trees. His hands were shaking, not with fear but with anger. And beneath the anger, something else. Recognition. He'd seen this before. In the army, on the frontier, in a dozen different places and situations. The face of power protecting itself. The look of men who'd done something terrible and would do anything to keep it hidden. Whatever happened here in 1867, it was bad enough that people were still willing to kill to keep it secret. And they'd just made their first mistake. They'd threatened Jedediah Crowe. They'd shown him they were scared. Scared men made mistakes. And Jed had made a career out of exploiting mistakes. He walked back to the barn, knowing they'd be watching, probably from the tree line. The doors stood open now, the interior violated and empty. But Jed hadn't told Brennan everything. In the moments before the sheriff arrived, while wrapping his hand around that locket, Jed had seen something else in the cavity, something wedged far back, out of easy reach. He'd left it there deliberately, and tonight, when the watchers grew bored or tired or cold, he'd come back for it, because whatever secret this barn held, whatever happened to MC and the others mentioned in those letters, it was connected to the Crowe name. That much he'd seen in the letters before Brennan arrived. The woman who wrote them had mentioned Marcus Crowe and his family, Jed's family, his blood. And now, whether Sheriff Brennan liked it or not, this had become personal. As the sun wested and shadows grew long across the clearing, Jed made a show of breaking camp. He loaded his wagon, covered his fire, and generally behaved like a man preparing to leave. But his rifle stayed close, and his eyes never stopped moving, cataloguing the terrain, marking positions, noting approaches. He'd spent 30 years learning how to read land and anticipate enemies. Those skills hadn't faded. When full darkness came and the mountains became black shapes against the stars, Jed lay in his bedroll near the wagon. To anyone watching from a distance, he appeared to be sleeping, but Jedediah Crowe was wide awake, watching the barn, waiting for his moment. And in the darkness, in that structure built over secrets and sorrow, something waited too. Not a ghost, not a curse, just truth, patient and persistent and ready to be found. All it needed was someone brave enough or stubborn enough to dig it out. Jed figured he qualified on both counts. 2 hours past midnight, when even the owls had gone quiet, Jed moved. He left his bedroll stuffed to look occupied and crossed the clearing in a crouch, using shadows and the natural contours of the land to stay hidden. His eyes had long since adjusted to the darkness, and the quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate by. The barn doors hung open like a wound. Jed slipped inside, moving by memory and touch more than sight. He had a small candle in his pocket, but wouldn't risk the light until he was sure no one was watching. He made his way to the northwest corner, where the false floor had been exposed, knelt, and reached into the cavity. His hand found what he'd left, a book-sized object wrapped in leather, wedged tight against one of the foundation stones. He worked it free carefully, the leather cracking slightly under his fingers. It came loose with a soft scraping sound that seemed too loud in the barn's silence. Jed retreated to the loft, where a small window faced away from where any watchers would likely position themselves. He struck a match, lit the candle, and shielded it with his body. The leather wrapping fell away to reveal pages. Not a complete book, but a section torn from one. The binding was ragged, suggesting violence in its removal. The pages were covered in handwriting, masculine this time. The letters formed with the precision of military training. At the top of the first page, in strong, clear script, Journal of Captain Marcus Crowe. 2nd Colorado Volunteers, discharged. Settlement of Coldwater Ridge, Wyoming Territory, 1867. Jed's breath caught. Captain Marcus Crowe. The same name from the letters, the same initials as the locket. And Crowe, his family name. The coincidence was too great. This man was kin somehow. Distant perhaps, but blood nonetheless. He read by the candle's flickering light. May 12th, 1867. We have arrived in the valley and found it all that the surveyor promised. Good timber, clear water and soil that will take crops if we work it properly. I have claimed land on the northern slope where the creek runs strong. My dear Martha is with child again, and this will be a good place to raise our family. The war is behind us now, and I am ready to build rather than destroy. May 30th, 1867. 17 families have joined us now. We have begun construction of permanent dwellings. The work is hard but satisfying. Veterans mostly, men who fought for the Union and survived, who now seek only peace and honest labor. We have named our settlement Coldwater Ridge, after the creek that sustains us. June 15th, 1867. Men from the Coldwater Mining Company arrived today. They were polite enough but made clear their interest in our land. They claim survey rights and mineral exploitation permits from the territorial government. I examined their documents. They appear legal, but the dates trouble me. They are recent, issued after we had already settled here. I informed them we have no intention of leaving. We have filed our claims properly and mean to stay. June 30th, 1867. The mining company representatives returned with an offer to purchase our claims. The money is significant, more than the land is worth for farming. But I have consulted with the other families, and we are unanimous. We did not survive war and hardship to be bought off by Eastern capitalists. We will stay July 10th, 1867. The tone has changed. Today, 3 men came, not representatives but enforcers. They spoke of accidents that could befall families in remote areas. They mentioned how easily cabins can catch fire, how dangerous mountain country is for children. I told them to leave and not return. They laughed. One of them said, "You can't fight progress, Captain, and you can't fight us." I have begun teaching the other men to stand watches at night, July 28th, 1867. Our livestock are being killed. 3 cattle butchered in the night, found with their throats cut. This is not the work of predators. This is meant to frighten us, to starve us out. Some families are wavering. I have called a meeting. We must stand together or fall separately. August 1st, 1867. The meeting was contentious, but resolved correctly. We will not be driven off. I have written to the territorial governor requesting protection and investigation of the mining company's claims. Several of us are veterans. We know how to defend ourselves if necessary, but I pray it does not come to violence. We have seen enough of war. To August 5th, 1867. No response from the governor. Martha says I should take the family and leave. She fears for our children. I cannot. If we run, we teach our children that bullies always win. We have the law on our side. We must trust in justice. August 12th, 1867. They have cut us off from town. The trail has been blocked by a rock slide that appears deliberate. We are isolated now. Several families are down to the last of their supplies. I've organized hunting parties and fishing details. We can survive without town if necessary, but the pressure is building. I feel it like a storm approaching. August 18th, 1867. A delegation from the company came today with a final offer. Double the previous amount and safe passage for all families. The spokesman was a man named Brennan, Thomas Brennan. He called himself an executive, but dressed like a gun hand. He gave us 3 days to decide. When I refused immediately, he said, "Then what happens next is on you, Captain. You're signing death warrants for these people." I ordered him off our land. As they rode away, one of them looked back and smiled. I've seen that smile before, on the faces of men about to do terrible things. August 20th, 1867. We are preparing defenses. I have positioned men at approaches to the settlement. We have stores of ammunition and enough food for perhaps 2 weeks if we ration. The children we have moved to the central area where we can better protect them. Martha asked me tonight if I am certain we are right to resist. I told her yes, but in truth, I am no longer certain of anything except that we cannot yield to threats and violence. That way lies a world I do not wish to leave to our children. August 22nd, 1867. No further contact from the company. The silence is worse than the threats. We are all waiting, watching. Some of the men want to take the fight to them, to ride into town and demand the territorial marshal intervene. I have forbidden it. We are in the right. We must act defensively, not aggressively. Justice must prevail, or we are no better than those who threaten us. August 23rd, 1867. Martha is having nightmares. She wakes crying, saying she dreams of fire and blood. I hold her and promise everything will be well, but I taste the lie in my mouth. Today, I wrote letters to my brother James in case the worst should happen. I have hidden these journal pages, where I pray they will be found if we... The entry ended there, mid-sentence. The next page had been torn away, and the remaining pages were blank except for the last one, which contained a single line in different handwriting, shakier, written with what looked like a pencil nearly worn to nothing. They came at night. God forgive us all. Jed sat in the darkness, the journal pages trembling in his hands. Marcus Crowe, his ancestor, had to be. The name, the time period, the military background. And James, Marcus had a brother named James. Jed's own father had been named James Crowe. The connection was there, had to be, though the exact genealogy escaped him in the moment. But it didn't matter. What mattered was what these pages told him. 17 families, a mining company, threats escalating to violence. And then silence, except it wasn't silence. It was massacre. The barn, this barn, sat where the settlement had been. Had to. And beneath it, beneath the false floor and the hidden cavity, there had been more. He'd felt it when he'd pulled up those boards, felt space extending beyond what he'd explored. The earth beneath the barn had been disturbed, filled in, leveled. This wasn't just a barn. It was a grave marker, a monument to silence, built deliberately over the place where something terrible had happened. Jed blew out the candle and sat in darkness, thinking. Marcus Crowe had written to his brother James. Those letters might have reached him, might not. But if they had, what had James done? Come looking for his brother, found what Brennan and the mining company left behind? Or had he never known, never learned what happened to Marcus and his family? A sound outside, soft but distinct. Footsteps on hard ground. Someone approaching the barn. Jed moved silently, tucking the journal pages inside his shirt and climbing down from the loft, using the support beams rather than the ladder. He reached ground level and pressed himself against the wall near the door, just as a figure appeared in the entrance. Not Brennan. Someone smaller, more hesitant. A woman. She carried a lantern turned low, and in its dim light, Jed could make out her features, perhaps 40 years old. Handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair pinned up and intelligent eyes that searched the barn's interior. She wore a practical dress and a heavy shawl against the night cold. "Mr. Crowe," she whispered, "I know you're here. I saw you cross the clearing." Jed stayed still, weighing options. "Please," the woman continued, "I'm not here to harm you. I'm Ruth Brennan, the sheriff's sister." That name brought Jed out of the shadows, though he kept his hand near his pistol. "Sheriff sent you to finish his warning?" She turned to face him, and he saw no fear in her expression, only determination. "My brother doesn't know I'm here. He'd be furious if he did. I came because—" She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Because I think you're right to ask questions. And I think you deserve answers. Why? Because I've spent my whole life here, and I've watched good people avoid this place, watched my brother threaten anyone who got too curious, watched the whole town participate in a lie. I'm tired of it. And when I heard you'd found things in the barn, I thought maybe someone was finally going to expose the truth." Jed studied her. Everything in his experience told him to be cautious. This could be a trap, a way to learn what he knew. But something in her voice rang true. The weariness, the shame. "What truth?" he asked. Ruth set the lantern down carefully. "The massacre, the one that happened here in 1867. 17 families murdered by men hired by the Coldwater Mining Company. Men including my great-grandfather. The admission hung in the air between them. Your family was involved," Jed said. "My family led it. Thomas Brennan, my great-grandfather, organized the whole thing. Hired gunmen from Kansas, men who'd killed before and would kill again. They came at night when people were sleeping. They burned the cabins, shot anyone who ran, and made sure there were no survivors. Then they buried the bodies in a mass grave, built this barn over it to mark the spot and keep people away, and spread the story that the settlers had simply moved on, left in the night. The territorial governor was paid to look the other way. The mining company got the land, and my family got paid handsomely for their services. How do you know all this?" "Because my grandfather told me before he died. He was Thomas Brennan's son, raised on the story, taught to be proud of it. Pioneer justice, he called it, protecting economic development from squatters. He thought I'd understand, that I'd see it as necessary. But all I saw was murder, mass murder of families, children included, and all for gold." "Gold?" Ruth nodded. "There's a vein of gold running through this valley. Rich deposit. The mining company knew about it, and so did the settlers, though they didn't realize how valuable it was. The company couldn't legally take the land, and they couldn't afford to wait for the claims to expire. So they did it the fast way. They killed everyone and made sure the truth died with them." Jed pulled out the journal pages. Marcus Crowe, he kept a record. This was hidden here. Ruth stepped closer, examining the pages by lantern light. Her hand went to her mouth. Oh God, he wrote it all down. The threats, the names. This is proof. Your brother took the rest. Letters, artifacts, everything. He'll destroy them. He has to. If this gets out, if people learn what really happened, the families involved will lose everything. Reputation, property, possibly face criminal charges. My brother Otis, he's not evil, Mr. Crowe, but he's protecting a legacy. He thinks if he can just keep it buried long enough, everyone who cares will die, and it won't matter anymore. It matters, Jed said quietly. It'll always matter. Those people deserve to be remembered. They deserve justice. Ruth met his eyes. That's why I'm here. I want to help you. Whatever you're planning, whatever you need, I'll help. Why? These are your people. Your family. No, her voice was firm. Those people were murdered. They're not those people. They were families with names and lives and futures, and my family killed them. I can't change that, but I can stop protecting the lie. I can help bring the truth to light. That's the only way to atone, Jed considered. He needed allies if he was going to pursue this, and Ruth Brennan brought insider knowledge. But trusting the sheriff's sister was a risk. As if reading his thoughts, Ruth said, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I have documents. My grandfather's papers. He kept records, names, dates, even some correspondence with the mining company. He hid them in case he ever needed leverage. I found them after he died. I'll give them all to you. When? Tomorrow. Come to my house after dark. I live on Oak Street, the blue house with white shutters. My brother will be at the saloon like he is every night. We'll have time to go through everything. Jed nodded slowly. All right, tomorrow night. Ruth picked up her lantern. Mr. Crowe, be careful. My brother meant what he said. If you stay here, if you keep pushing, he will have you killed. He's done it before. The drifters who disappeared. Yes, men who asked too many questions. One was a journalist, another was a federal surveyor. They came looking for the truth and found graves instead. I'm harder to kill than most, Jed said. Ruth's smile was sad. That's what they all thought. She left then, slipping out into the darkness as quietly as she'd come. Jed waited, watching to make sure she wasn't followed, then made his own way back to his camp. The journal pages burned against his skin, where he'd tucked them under his shirt. Tomorrow night he'd learn more. Tomorrow night he'd see what other evidence existed. And then he'd decide his next move. But one thing was already certain. He wasn't leaving, not now. Not when he'd found his own blood story written in desperation and ended in violence. Marcus Crowe had tried to do the right thing, had stood firm for justice and principle, and it had gotten him and his family killed. Jed intended to finish what his ancestor had started, even if it killed him too. The riders stopped at the tree line, maybe a dozen of them, assessing the barn and its defenders. Jed watched them through a gap in the barn wall, counting heads and estimating capabilities. Professional fighters, most of them, the kind of men who sold violence for wages and asked no questions about right or wrong, but there were others too. Two figures Jed recognized from town, Samuel Pritchard and another man who Ruth identified as the mayor, Howard Holcomb. They sat their horses well back from the professional guns, directing rather than participating. Cowards, Ruth muttered, watching them. They hire others to do their killing while they stay safe. Standard practice for men like that, Jed said. Collins, you see the big fellow on the roan horse front center? Yes, sir. That'll be their leader. Professional gun hand, probably from Kansas or Texas. He'll coordinate the assault. When it starts, he's the priority target. Take him down and the others lose direction. Collins nodded, checking his rifle. The young deputy had steadied as the situation clarified, his fear transmuting into focused readiness. Jed had seen it before in soldiers. Sometimes men discovered courage only when forced to choose between fighting and dying. A voice called across the clearing. Crowe, Ruth, we know you're in there. It was Pritchard, his reedy voice carrying poorly across the distance. This doesn't have to end badly. We're prepared to negotiate. What terms? Jed called back. Return the documents. Leave Coldwater Ridge. We'll let you go unharmed. Ruth laughed bitterly. They burned my house with us inside. Their word means nothing. She's right, Jed said. But let's keep them talking. By time for Brennan to get help. He raised his voice. The documents are already gone, Pritchard. Sent to Cheyenne. Federal Marshal will have them by tomorrow. Silence from the tree line. Then urgent consultation, the mayor and Pritchard conferring with the lead gunman. Finally, Pritchard called again, his voice tighter now. You're lying. No stages left town. Freight wagon! Left at dawn, Ruth shouted. Tom Hutchins is carrying a full report of everything. Names, dates, evidence. It's over. More consultation. Then the mayor himself rode forward slightly, a portly man who looked uncomfortable on horseback. You've made a grave error, interfered in matters that don't concern you. We're prepared to... He never finished the sentence. The lead gunman made some signal Jed couldn't see, and suddenly the riders spurred forward in a loose line, weapons drawn, charging across the clearing. Here they come, Jed shouted. Wait for range. Make your shots count. The distance closed rapidly. 200 yards, 150, 100. Jed had positioned himself and Collins at the front wall, Ruth at the side window with her brother's rifle. The attackers came on hard, betting on speed and numbers to overwhelm the defenders before they could inflict serious casualties. They bet wrong. At 75 yards, Jed fired. His bullet took the lead rider, not the leader but the man beside him, high in the chest, spinning him from his saddle. Collins fired a second later, and another rider went down, his horse bolting riderless. The charge faltered slightly. The remaining riders scattered, seeking cover, their assault broken before it truly began. Return fire came quickly, bullets slamming into the barn's thick walls, but penetrating only inches into the dense timber. Hold positions, Jed called. Let them waste ammunition. For several minutes, a desultory exchange continued. The attackers fired from cover at the tree line. The defenders returned fire when targets presented themselves. 2 more riders went down, both wounded rather than killed, dragged back into the forest by their companions. Then came a lull. Jed used it to redistribute ammunition and check on Ruth. You all right? I've never shot at a person before, she said, her hands shaking slightly. But yes, I'm all right. You don't have to kill anyone. Just make them keep their heads down. They tried to burn us alive, Jed. They killed those 17 families, including children. If I have to kill someone to stop them, she met his eyes. I'll do it, Jed nodded, seeing the steel beneath her fear. Good, because they're going to try something different now. That frontal charge was a test, seeing how well we're armed and positioned. Next will be more methodical, he was right. Over the next hour, the attackers probed the barn's defenses, trying different approaches. 3 men attempted to circle around to the back, but Ruth spotted them, and her well-placed shots sent them scrambling back to cover. 2 others tried to approach from the creek side, using the depression for cover, but Collins drove them off. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew hot. Inside the barn, the temperature rose uncomfortably. They rationed water carefully, knowing a prolonged siege would test their endurance as much as their ammunition. Around mid-morning, Doc Harlan appeared at the tree line, not with the attackers, but approaching from the north under a white flag, improvised from a shirt tied to a stick. The shooting stopped as he walked slowly across the clearing, an old man making his way carefully across rough ground. Jed met him at the barn door, rifle ready in case of treachery. But Harlan came alone and unarmed. Mr. Crowe. Ruth. Harlan nodded to them both. I bring news. Sheriff Brennan made it to you? He did. And I've done as you asked, sent word to everyone I trust. Clara is documenting everything. We've sent riders to the county seat and the territorial capital. But Harlan's expression was grave. Help won't arrive for at least 2 days, maybe 3. The territorial marshal is in the southern district, and the army garrison is even farther. You're on your own until then. We can hold that long, Jed said, though he wasn't certain. There's more. The town is splitting. About half the people, once they learn the truth, are refusing to support this action. They're demanding the attack stop, that proper authorities be brought in. But the families involved, the conspirators, they're desperate now. They know if you survive to testify, they'll face federal prosecution. They're talking about bringing in more guns from Laramie, from Cheyenne even. This could become a full siege. Ruth stepped forward. "What about my brother?" "Safe. He's with Clara and several others at the church. They've declared sanctuary and are prepared to defend it if necessary. The town is essentially split down the middle now. Those who want the truth exposed and those who'll do anything to keep it hidden. Civil war in miniature," Jed said quietly. "Precisely." Harlan looked back toward the tree line where the attackers waited. "I've been sent to make one final offer. Pritchard and the others will provide safe passage out of the territory for you and Ruth. You keep the documents, expose the historical crime, but you leave the current town leadership alone. No prosecution for the cover-up or the recent violence, and the gold under the barn," Jed asked. Harlan's expression confirmed it. "They keep rights to it. Consider it compensation for the exposure of their ancestors' crimes. Blood money," Ruth said flatly. "The answer is no. I told them you'd say that." Harlan sighed. "Then I'm to tell you they'll burn you out. They have enough men to surround the barn completely, and enough kerosene to turn this whole structure into an inferno. They'll give you until sunset to reconsider. Tell them to go to hell," Jed said. "And Doc, thank you for everything you've done." Harlan nodded slowly. "I'm an old man, Mr. Crowe. I've lived with shame and silence my whole life. If this is my chance to make it right, I'll take it regardless of the cost." He turned to leave, then paused. "There's one more thing. The freight wagon, the one carrying your documents to Cheyenne. It was stopped 20 miles out of town. Driver and his boy killed, wagon burned. They got the documents. The news hit like a physical blow." Ruth made a small sound of despair. Jed felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. Their one chance to get evidence out before the confrontation, gone. "But," Harlan continued, his eyes twinkling slightly, "Tom Hutchins was no fool. He suspected something might happen, so he made copies. Gave the originals to his boy to carry in a satchel, but kept copies hidden in the wagon's false bottom. The men who stopped him found the satchel, assumed they'd gotten everything and left. But the copies survived. I have them now, and they're already on their way to Cheyenne by a different route, with different carriers who won't be traced." Hope rekindled. "How long until they reach Cheyenne?" "If the riders push hard, day and a half. The territorial attorney will have everything by Thursday morning at the latest. Then we hold until Thursday," Jed said. "Whatever it takes." Harlan left, his white flag hanging limp in the still air. As he crossed back to the tree line, Jed saw the attackers gathering, their numbers visibly increased. More men had arrived while they'd been talking, reinforcements from town, or hired guns from elsewhere. "We're outnumbered at least 20 to 1 now," Collins observed. "Numbers don't matter as much as position and will," Jed said. "They have to come to us, across open ground, against prepared defenses. And they're fighting for profit. We're fighting for something more important. Justice?" Ruth asked. "Memory. Those 53 people buried under this barn, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. That's worth dying for if necessary." The afternoon passed in tense watchfulness. The attackers made no move, content to let the heat and uncertainty wear down the defenders. Jed rotated positions, ensuring everyone got rest, water, and food from his meager supplies. He also used the time to prepare additional defenses, sharpened stakes positioned around the barn's perimeter, drip wires made from fishing line, anything that would slow or channel an assault. As sunset approached, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the attackers finally moved. But not to assault, to encircle. Riders positioned themselves at regular intervals around the clearing, creating a cordon. Then men on foot began carrying containers toward the barn, staying just out of rifle range. "Kerosene," Collins said, watching through a gap. "Just like Doc said. They're going to burn us out." Ruth's face was pale but determined. "There has to be a way to stop them." Jed was already thinking through options. The barn's walls were thick and had been dampened earlier with their precious water supply, but a sustained fire fed by kerosene would eventually catch. And once it did, the whole structure would go up. They'd have to run, and in the open they'd be cut down easily unless they didn't run toward the tree line. "The creek," Jed said suddenly. "It's only 30 yards from the back of the barn. If we time it right, we can make it to the water before they react. And then what?" Collins asked. "They'll just follow us. The creek runs through a gorge a half-mile downstream. Narrow, with high walls. Defensible. We make it there, we can hold them off indefinitely. Water, cover, and a position they can't surround. It's a desperate plan, Ruth said. Better than burning. Jed checked his weapons. We wait until the fire is well established, until they think we're trapped and committed to defending the barn. Then we go out the back all at once, fast and low. Collins, you lead. You're youngest and fastest. Ruth in the middle. I'll bring up the rear and provide covering fire. They prepared quickly, gathering only what they could carry. Weapons, ammunition, the documents, and 1 canteen each. Everything else would be abandoned. As full darkness fell, the attackers made their move. Torches appeared along the tree line, and men advanced carrying containers of kerosene. They came within 50 yards and began splashing the accelerant on the barn's walls, working methodically around the structure. Jed held his fire. Too early and they'd stop. He needed them committed, needed the fire started before he made his move. The first torch was thrown. It hit the front wall, and flames erupted, spreading quickly along the kerosene trail. More torches followed, and within minutes the barn was ringed with fire. The heat became intense almost immediately, and smoke began filtering through gaps in the walls. Not yet, Jed said, watching the flames spread. Not yet. The fire built rapidly, feeding on old dry wood and the accelerant. The attackers fell back, watching their work, confident now. Some were already celebrating, passing around bottles, certain of their victory. Now, Jed shouted. Collins kicked open the back door and ran, sprinting for the creek with Ruth close behind. Jed followed, pausing only to fire 3 quick shots toward the nearest attackers, making them dive for cover. They crossed the 30 yards in seconds that felt like hours, expecting bullets to tear into them at any moment. But the surprise was complete. The attackers had been watching the front. Certain no one could escape through the flames at the back, they hit the creek and kept running, splashing through shallow water, using the creek bed for cover. Behind them, shouts of alarm as someone realized they'd escaped. Then gunfire, bullets kicking up water around them. But they were moving in darkness, partially concealed by the creek banks. Return fire was sporadic and poorly aimed. Jed fired back twice more, keeping the pursuers cautious, then concentrated on running. The creek narrowed as promised, the banks rising on either side. Jed could hear pursuit behind them, men splashing through water, cursing in the darkness. But the narrow confines made pursuit difficult, and the defenders had the advantage of knowing where they were going. They rounded a bend and found it, the gorge Jed remembered from his initial exploration of the property. The creek cut through solid rock here, the walls 20 feet high and nearly vertical. The water flowed through a channel barely 10 feet wide, with a narrow shelf on one side where they could take position. Here, Jed called. Collins, take the high position on that ledge. Ruth, behind that boulder. I'll cover the approach. They scrambled into position just as the first pursuers came around the bend. Jed fired once, and the lead man went down, blocking the narrow channel. The others behind him pulled back quickly, reassessing. For several minutes there was silence, except for the sound of running water and distant shouting as more attackers arrived. Then someone called out. It was the lead gunman, his voice professional and calm. "You've got nowhere to go, Crowe. We can wait you out, or we can come in shooting. Your choice. Or you can wait for the federal marshal," Jed called back. "He'll be here by Thursday. Then you're all facing prosecution. If that marshal was coming, he'd be here already." "You're bluffing, am I?" "You willing to bet your life on that? Because that's what you're doing. Every man who participated in tonight's attack will face federal charges. Murder, arson, conspiracy? You want to add more bodies to that count?" Silence. "Then we're being paid well enough to take the risk. No amount of money is worth hanging. You've got a chance to walk away." "Take it. Can't do that, Crowe. We've got a reputation to maintain. We were hired to do a job, and we finish what we start." "Then you'll die here," Jed called back. "Because I promise you I'm not surrendering, and I'm not going quietly." More silence. Jed could almost hear the mental calculations happening, weighing the money against the risk, professional pride against survival instinct. Men like this were dangerous, but not suicidal. Push them hard enough and they'd break. Tell you what, the gunman called. Give us the woman and the deputy. You keep the documents, expose whatever you want. But those two come with us. Insurance that you don't cause more trouble. No deal, Ruth shouted before Jed could respond. I'm not leaving. Me neither, Collins added. Jed felt pride swell in his chest. They'd both had chances to walk away, to save themselves, but they'd chosen to stand. That was rare. That was the kind of courage that changed history. You heard them, Jed called. We're staying together. Now here's my offer. You've got 1 hour to clear out. After that, anyone still here is an enemy and will be treated as such. And when that federal marshal arrives, I'll make sure he knows who showed good sense and left versus who stayed and kept fighting. No response this time. Just whispered consultation and the sound of men moving in the darkness. Jed used the lull to check on Ruth and Collins, both settled into their positions and alert. You think they'll leave? Ruth asked quietly. Some will. Hired guns are practical people. Once they realize the money isn't worth the risk, they'll drift away. The real believers, Pritchard, Holcomb, the family members with everything to lose, they'll stay. But their numbers will be smaller. And then we hold until help arrives. Simple as that. But nothing about their situation was simple, and Jed knew it. They had limited ammunition, limited water, and no food except what they carried. The gorge was defensible, but also a trap if the attackers decided to simply wait them out. And there was no guarantee help would arrive in time or at all. But they had something the attackers didn't, the absolute certainty that their cause was just. That mattered more than supplies or numbers. It always had. As the night deepened and stars emerged overhead, Jed settled in to wait. Behind him, Ruth was checking the documents, making sure they'd survived the escape intact. Collins was watching the approach, his rifle ready. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, their enemies were making their own calculations. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they'd survived the day, and that counted for something. They'd survived, and the truth had survived with them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tomorrow was still hours away, and for now, they held their ground. That was enough. The night passed slowly, measured in heartbeats and the sound of water flowing over stone. Jed took first watch, while Ruth and Collins tried to rest on the narrow shelf. The gorge's high walls blocked most of the starlight, creating a darkness so complete that Jed had to rely on hearing more than sight. Around midnight he heard movement upstream, careful, deliberate, someone trying to approach quietly. Jed waited, letting them come closer, his rifle aimed at the sound. When he judged them within 20 yards, he fired once into the darkness. A cry of pain, then splashing as someone retreated rapidly. No further attempts came from that direction. At dawn, the situation became clearer. Looking back toward where they'd come from, Jed could see the barn, or what remained of it. The structure still stood, but it was a burned-out shell. The roof collapsed and the walls charred black. Smoke still rose from the ruins, and around it, scattered at a distance, were perhaps 8 men. The rest had left during the night, just as Jed predicted. The ones who remained were the true believers, the ones with too much to lose to walk away. Ruth woke and came to stand beside him, looking at the destroyed barn. All those years standing over that ground. Now it's exposed. We'll have to excavate properly, Jed said. Give those people proper burial. Let their families know what happened if any remain. My family did that, Ruth said quietly. My blood. How do I live with that? By making it right. By making sure it's remembered and honored. That's all any of us can do. Acknowledge the past honestly and try to build something better from it. Collins joined them, young face grim. I count 8 hostiles. That's still long odds. But they're exposed, Jed pointed out. No cover except the tree line. If they want us, they have to come down this gorge, and it's a killing ground. They know it. That's why they're hesitating. As if to prove his point, a voice called out. Samuel Pritchard, sounding exhausted and desperate. Crowe, this is your last chance! The territorial government won't help you. They're as corrupt as anyone. You're fighting for nothing. Jed didn't bother responding. Let Pritchard waste his breath. You don't understand. Pritchard continued. That gold under the barn, it's worth a fortune. Enough to make everyone rich. We could share it. You, Ruth, everyone. Just stop fighting and let this go." Now Jed did respond, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "The only thing under that barn worth anything is the truth, Pritchard. And you can't buy that or bury it. The truth will destroy this town. Is that what you want? Hundreds of innocent people suffering for what their ancestors did. Their ancestors murdered 53 people, including children. That debt doesn't expire just because time passed. You self-righteous fool. You'll die here for nothing. I'll die here for something that matters. Can you say the same?" No response to that. Jed watched through a gap in the rocks as Pritchard consulted with the others, their body language showing disagreement and frustration. Good. Let them fracture. Let doubt do what bullets couldn't. Around mid-morning, Doc Harlan appeared again, this time accompanied by an unexpected figure, Clara Whitmore, the elderly librarian. Both carried bundles and approached under another improvised white flag. Jed met them at the edge of the gorge, rifle ready but lowered. "This is dangerous, Doc. You shouldn't have brought Clara." "Wasn't his choice," Clara said tartly. She was perhaps 70, with iron-grey hair and sharp eyes behind spectacles. I insisted. "Someone needs to document what's happening here, and I'm the town's historian." She had a notebook and was already writing in it, recording details with the precision of a scholar. Doc Harlan handed Jed a bundle. "Food, water, medical supplies. It's not much, but it should help. How'd you get past them?" Collins asked. "They let us through. Even desperate men respect a white flag, and they know how it would look to shoot an old doctor and an elderly woman. Bad for their cause, such as it is." "What's happening in town?" Ruth asked. "Civil war, essentially," Doc said. "The church has become a sanctuary for those opposed to this action. Your brother is there, along with perhaps 40 others. They're armed and prepared to defend themselves. The conspirators and their supporters control the rest of town, but they're outnumbered now. Once word got out about what really happened in 1867 and what's happening now, most people turned against them." Clara looked up from her notes. "I've documented everything. Every name, every action, every threat and violent act. When proper authorities arrive, they'll have a complete record." She fixed Jed with a penetrating stare. "You need to survive, Mr. Crowe. You're the key witness. Everything depends on your testimony." "No pressure then," Jed said dryly. "I'm serious. If you die here, they'll spin this as a tragic misunderstanding. A disturbed drifter who caused trouble, spread false rumors, sparked violence. They'll bury the truth again, and this time they'll bury it so deep no one will ever find it. Then I'll stay alive," Jed said simply. "That's the plan anyway." Doc Harlan pulled him aside, lowering his voice. "There's something else. Something I found in my grandfather's papers last night. I should have mentioned it earlier, but I didn't understand its significance until I saw—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Your father. James Crowe. He was here in 1867. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. "What?" "He was a lieutenant in the 7th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Laramie. When the massacre happened, when Marcus and his family were killed, the military was called in to investigate. Your father led the investigation." Jed felt the world tilting. He knew what happened to Marcus?" "He wrote a report. A full, detailed report documenting the massacre and naming the perpetrators. He was prepared to bring charges to see justice done." Doc's expression was sorrowful. "But the report was suppressed. Orders came down from the territorial government, the same government that had been paid off by the mining company. Your father was told to close the investigation, to report that the settlers had simply left the area of their own accord. And he obeyed," Jed said hollowly. "He had no choice. He was a soldier. Orders are orders. But it destroyed him." Doc pulled out a piece of paper, old, yellowed, covered in familiar handwriting. "This is from my grandfather's journal. An entry about meeting with your father after the investigation was closed." Jed took the paper and read, "Met with Lieutenant James Crowe today. The man is broken. He knows what happened here, knows who was responsible, and knows his report will never see the light of day. He came to me because I was there, because I know the truth too. He asked if there was anything we could do, any way to bring justice. I told him the truth, that we are powerless against the forces arrayed against us. He wept then like a child, said he had a brother once, Marcus, who'd come west to settle, lost touch years ago. When he saw the name Marcus Crowe on the list of victims, he knew it was his brother, his brother's wife, his brother's children, all murdered, and he can do nothing. I gave him whiskey. We drank together, two cowards mourning our failure. Jed stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hands. Everything made sense now. His father's distance, his drinking, his haunted silence, the way he'd warned Jed away from military service, the bitterness that had colored his final years. He hadn't just witnessed an injustice. He'd been forced to cover up the murder of his own brother. My God, Jed whispered. He carried that his whole life. And now you know why, Doc said gently. This isn't just about Marcus Crowe and 17 families. It's about your father, too. About giving him the justice he couldn't obtain in life. Jed looked up, and Doc saw something in his face that made the old man step back. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more final. The look of a man who'd found his purpose and would see it through no matter the cost. Thank you, Doc, for telling me. For everything. Doc and Clara left, taking their white flag back across the clearing. Jed watched them go, then returned to where Ruth and Collins waited. What did the doctor tell you? Ruth asked, seeing his expression. Jed told them everything. About his father, about Marcus, about the report that should have brought justice but was buried instead. When he finished, both Ruth and Collins were silent, understanding the weight of what this meant. So it's personal for you too, Ruth finally said. Your father was another victim of the cover-up. All these years I thought he was just a broken man who drank too much. I judged him for it, resented him for not being the father I needed. Jed's voice was rough with emotion, but he was carrying impossible weight. He saw evil and was ordered to protect it. It killed something in him, and now you have a chance to finish what he started, Collins said. To get the justice he couldn't. That's exactly right. Jed checked his rifle, his movements precise and deliberate. They're going to come for us soon. Probably tonight. They know help might arrive tomorrow or the next day, so they'll make their move before then. Final assault, everything they have. Can we hold? Ruth asked. We'll hold. Jed met her eyes. Because we have to. Because 53 souls are counting on us. Because my father's honor depends on it. Because sometimes the only thing separating civilization from barbarism is people willing to stand for what's right, even when it costs everything. The day passed in tense preparation. They used the supplies Doc brought to fortify their position, ate sparingly, and conserved ammunition. Jed showed Collins how to create crossfire zones, how to make each shot count, how to use terrain to maximum advantage. The young deputy learned quickly, his face set with determination. Ruth organized the documents, creating multiple copies using paper Clara had thoughtfully included. She wrapped them in oilcloth and hid them in different locations within the gorge. If something happens to us, she explained, maybe these will survive. Maybe someone else will find them and finish what we started. As evening approached, Jed made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been examining the gorge walls, looking for alternate escape routes, when he noticed something odd. On the far wall, about 12 feet up, was a darker patch that looked like it might be a crack or cave opening. Collins, give me a boost. I want to check something. With the deputy's help, Jed climbed up to investigate. What he found made his heart race. It wasn't just a crack, it was a tunnel, natural or man-made, leading back into the rock. And inside, barely visible in the fading light, were objects. He climbed into the tunnel and found more artifacts. Old blankets, tin plates, a child's doll, and most significantly a small metal box. Inside the box was a medallion, silver, tarnished black with age, bearing an insignia Jed recognized with a shock, the 7th Cavalry, his father's unit. On the back of the medallion, engraved in careful script, was a name. Lieutenant James Crowe, 7th Cavalry, 1867. Jed sat in the tunnel, holding the medallion, and understood. His father had been here, had found this place, had left this here deliberately, hidden where only someone searching carefully would find it. A message across time, a testament to his inability to act but his refusal to forget. More than that, though, Jed found papers wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and time. He brought them into the fading light and read. They were copies of his father's original report, the one that had been suppressed. Every detail, every name, every piece of evidence carefully documented. Everything needed to prove what had happened in 1867 and who was responsible. His father had kept a copy, had hidden it here in this remote gorge, perhaps hoping that someday someone would find it, would have the courage to do what he couldn't. "Jed," Ruth called up. "What did you find?" He climbed down, clutching the medallion and the papers. When he showed them, explained what they were, Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Your father," she said. "He didn't give up. He just had to wait for the right person to carry it forward. And that person is me," Jed said. "His son, Marcus's nephew, the one who found this place, who opened that barn, who refused to walk away." He looked at the medallion in his palm, feeling the weight of 3 generations. "This ends here tonight. Whatever happens, the truth survives. I'll make sure of it." As darkness fell, and they prepared for the coming assault, Jed felt something he hadn't felt in years. Connection. To his father, to Marcus, to all the victims of the massacre and the cover-up that followed. He wasn't alone in this fight. He carried the hopes of the dead and the honor of those who'd tried and failed. That was more powerful than any number of hired guns or desperate conspirators. That was what would see them through the night ahead. The final confrontation was coming, and Jedediah Crowe was ready. Night fell over the gorge like a curtain, and with it came the certain knowledge that the final assault would happen in darkness. Jed positioned Ruth and Collins at strategic points, ensuring overlapping fields of fire while maintaining the ability to retreat deeper into the gorge if necessary. The tunnel he'd discovered offered a last resort escape route, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Remember," Jed told them quietly, "they need to come to us. We hold this position as long as we can, but don't be heroes. If we have to fall back, we fall back together. Survival matters more than pride. What if they rush us all at once?" Collins asked, his young face serious in the starlight. "Then we make them pay for every foot. They're not soldiers. They're guns for hire. They'll break if we hit them hard enough. Trust your training and trust each other." Ruth checked her rifle one more time. She'd grown steadier over the past day, her initial fear transmuted into calm determination. "What about after? If we survive, what happens to Coldwater Ridge?" "That's not for us to decide," Jed said. "We expose the truth. Let justice take its course. Some people will be ruined, families destroyed. But that's the price of building prosperity on murder. Sometimes you can't avoid consequences. You can only face them honestly." "My family will be destroyed," Ruth said quietly. "Everything my great-grandfather built, everything we own, it'll all be taken or lost. Would you rather keep it, knowing where it came from?" "No." Her answer was immediate. "I'd rather have nothing and be able to sleep at night than have everything and carry this shame." "Then you're stronger than most people," Jed said. Around 10 o'clock, the attack began. Not with a charge or assault, but with something more insidious: fire arrows. They came arcing out of the darkness, trailing flame, aimed at the positions where Jed and the others had been visible during the day. "Down!" Jed shouted, and they all pressed against the rock as arrows clattered around them. Most fell into the creek and were extinguished, but a few struck the wooden supplies Doc had brought. And small fires started. Collins scrambled to put them out, while Ruth and Jed returned fire toward where the arrows had originated. The flames made them targets, but also gave them light to shoot by. Jed heard a cry of pain from the darkness. At least one shot had found its mark. The fire arrows stopped, and for several minutes there was silence. Then came voices, calling from different directions. The attackers had split up, some upstream and some downstream, trying to create confusion about where the main assault would come from. "Crowe, you hearing me?" It was the lead gunman, his voice echoing off the gorge walls from somewhere upstream. "I hear you." Jed called back. "This is pointless. You've got maybe 30 rounds of ammunition left between the 3 of you." "We've got hundreds!" "You've got 1 canteen of water." "We control the creek." "You can't win this." I don't need to win. I just need to survive until Thursday. You won't make it to Thursday. Hell, you won't make it to dawn. Then come and finish it, Jed shouted. Stop talking and start moving. Or are you scared? The taunt worked. Within minutes, Jed heard movement from both directions. Men wading through the creek, using its sound to mask their approach. They were coming from upstream and downstream simultaneously, trying to catch the defenders in a pincer. Ruth, watch upstream. Collins, downstream! I'll float between you. Jed positioned himself where he could support either direction. His military training had covered exactly this scenario, defending a narrow position against superior numbers. The key was not to panic, to pick targets carefully, and to make the enemy pay for every advance. The first figure appeared downstream, silhouetted against the lesser darkness of the sky. Collins fired and the figure fell. More movement, and Ruth fired upstream, her shot followed by a curse of pain. Then they came in earnest, 3 men downstream, 2 upstream, all firing as they advanced. The gorge erupted in thunder and muzzle flash, bullets sparking off rock, ricocheting wildly. Jed fired methodically, each shot aimed and controlled. One attacker down, then another. Ruth's rifle cracked repeatedly, and Collins was holding his ground despite his youth and fear. But the attackers were brave or desperate or both, and they kept coming. One made it to within 10 yards of Collins before the deputy's shot caught him high in the chest and spun him around. Another reached Ruth's position, and she had to use her rifle as a club, striking him across the face before he could bring his own weapon to bear. Jed shot that man, then swung his rifle toward a figure emerging from the creek directly in front of him. The lead gunman, finally joining the fight himself. They fired simultaneously, both shots missing in the chaos. Then they were too close for rifles, and it became a struggle of strength and will. The gunman was younger, stronger, but Jed had decades of experience and the desperation of a man with nothing to lose. They grappled, fell into the shallow water, each trying to gain advantage. Jed felt a knife blade scrape his ribs, twisted away, brought his knee up hard into the other man's gut. The gunman gasped, loosened his grip, and Jed got his hand on his pistol. He fired point blank, and the gunman jerked once and went still. The gunfire stopped. Sudden, jarring silence except for heavy breathing and the eternal sound of the creek. Jed dragged himself out of the water, checking on Ruth and Collins. Both were alive, unhurt except for minor cuts and bruises. They're falling back, Collins said, watching the darkness. We drove them off. For now, Jed said. Check ammunition. Reload everything. They'll try again, but they didn't. An hour passed, then 2, and there was no further assault. Jed used the time to tend wounds, redistribute ammunition, and reinforce their positions. They had perhaps 20 rounds left between them, enough for one more fight if they were lucky. Near dawn, a voice called out, not one of the gunmen, but Samuel Pritchard, sounding old and defeated. Crowe? You still alive? Still alive, Pritchard. The hired guns are gone. Left after you killed their leader. Said the money wasn't worth it. A pause. It's just us now. The families. The ones who have everything to lose. Then walk away, Pritchard. There's still time. When the federal marshal gets here, cooperation will mean leniency. You don't understand. We can't walk away. Everything we have, everything we are. It's all built on what our families did. If the truth comes out, we lose it all. Our names, our property, our futures. We become pariahs. You already are pariahs, Ruth called out. You just haven't admitted it yet. You can't build anything lasting on murder and lies. It catches up eventually. Ruth, Pritchard's voice cracked. Your own family is just as guilty. You'll suffer the same consequences. I know, and I accept that. Because being able to look at myself in the mirror is worth more than any property or reputation. Silence. Then Pritchard spoke again, and this time his voice was different, resigned, exhausted. We're coming in, but not to fight. We're done. How do I know this isn't a trick? Jed called. Because I'm tired. We're all tired. And because you were right, the gold isn't worth this. Nothing is worth this. Jed watched as 5 figures emerged from the trees, walking slowly across the clearing with their hands raised. Pritchard, Mayor Holcomb, and 3 others Jed didn't recognize. No weapons visible. They walked like defeated men, shoulders slumped, their fight gone. When they reached the gorge entrance, Jed kept his rifle trained on them. Weapons on the ground. All of them. Knives, hideout guns, everything. They complied, producing a small arsenal that clattered onto the rocks. Pritchard looked directly at Jed, and there was nothing left in his face but weariness. It's over. We surrender. We'll cooperate with whatever investigation comes. He glanced at the burned barn in the distance. Just let us bury them properly. The people we killed. Let us do that much right. That's not my decision, Jed said. That's for the authorities. Please. Pritchard's voice broke. My great-uncle helped kill those people. I've carried that knowledge my whole life. The least I can do is help lay them to rest with dignity. Jed looked at Ruth. She nodded slowly. Let them. They can't undo what was done, but they can honor the dead. That's something. All right, Jed said. But you stay where we can see you until proper authorities arrive. And you document everything, where you found each body, any identifying items, everything. Those people deserve to be known. As dawn broke fully, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose, the men began the grim work of excavation. Doc Harlan arrived with Clara and others from town, bringing tools and supplies. Sheriff Brennan came too, no longer wearing his badge, ready to help with the recovery and to face whatever consequences awaited him. Jed supervised from a distance, ensuring no evidence was disturbed or destroyed. But mostly he watched as the truth literally came to light. Skeletal remains, artifacts, the physical proof of massacre that could never be denied or explained away. By mid-morning, they'd found the first complete burial, a family of 4 buried together. A man's arms still wrapped around what had been his wife and children. Clara documented everything with photographs she'd brought, her scientific precision never faltering, even as tears ran down her weathered face. How many? Ruth asked quietly, standing beside Jed. They found remains of 37 people so far. Still excavating. Jed's voice was rough. Men, women, children, all murdered in their sleep or trying to flee, just like the document said. And we almost let them stay forgotten. But we didn't, that's what matters. Around noon, riders appeared on the horizon, a large group moving fast. Jed tensed, hand moving to his rifle until he recognized the flag they carried. Federal authority. Finally, the lead rider was a tall man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. He dismounted with the grace of a career lawman and surveyed the scene with sharp, assessing eyes. I'm Federal Marshal William Thornton, he announced. Territorial governor sent me to investigate reports of violence and historical crimes. Someone want to tell me what in the hell is going on here? Jed stepped forward. I can do that, Marshal. It's a long story. Then you better start talking, Mr. Crowe, Jedediah Crowe. Recognition flickered in Thornton's eyes. Any relation to Lieutenant James Crowe, 7th Cavalry? My father. You knew him? Served with him during the war, good man. Honest to a fault. Thornton's expression softened slightly. Heard he died hard, drinking. Always wondered what broke him. I can tell you that too, Marshal. It's all part of the same story. They talked for hours. Jed laid out everything, the barn, the hidden documents, Marcus Crowe's journal, Doc Harlan's grandfather's medical report, Ruth's family papers, and finally, his father's suppressed military report. He showed Thornton the medallion, explained how his father had hidden the evidence here, hoping someone would find it. Thornton listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. When Jed finished, the marshal was silent for a long moment. This is the worst thing I've seen in 30 years of law enforcement, he said finally. And I've seen some terrible things. The massacre itself was bad enough, but the cover-up, the deliberate systematic suppression of justice, that's what makes this truly evil. What happens now? Ruth asked. Now? Federal investigation. Full excavation and identification of remains. Criminal charges against everyone involved in the cover-up and recent violence. Civil proceedings to strip illegally obtained property from the conspirators' families. Thornton looked at her directly. That includes your family, Miss Brennan. I'm sorry, but the law is the law. I understand. I accept whatever comes. Thornton nodded with what looked like respect. You'll be treated fairly. Your cooperation and courage will be noted. He turned to Pritchard and the others. "The rest of you, you're under arrest. Charges to include conspiracy, attempted murder, arson, and obstruction of justice. You'll be transported to the territorial capital for trial." As his deputies moved to secure the prisoners, Thornton pulled Jed aside. "Your father would be proud of you. He tried to do the right thing and was prevented. You finished what he started. I just opened a barn door, Marshal. Everything else followed from that. Don't sell yourself short. You could have walked away a dozen times. Most men would have. But you stood, and you fought, and you brought truth to light. That takes a special kind of courage." Thornton glanced at the excavation site. "Those people have been waiting 16 years for justice. You gave it to them." Over the next several days, the full scope of the massacre became clear. 53 bodies in total, just as the historical documents indicated. 17 families killed in a single night, buried in a mass grave and forgotten. But now they would be remembered. Now they would have names and stones and recognition. Clara worked tirelessly to identify remains through artifacts found with them. A wedding ring with initials, a locket with a photograph, a child's toy with a name carved into it. Slowly, the victims became people again rather than numbers. The Thomas family, Samuel, age 34, Martha, age 29, and their 3 children. The Walsh family, the Rodriguez family, and Marcus Crowe, age 38, with his wife Catherine and their 2 children. Jed stood over his ancestor's grave when it was identified, holding the medallion his father had left behind. 3 generations connected by tragedy and justice, delayed, but finally delivered. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said quietly. "I'm sorry no one listened when you tried to do the right thing. I'm sorry my father couldn't help you, but you're not forgotten now. None of you are forgotten." Ruth appeared beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "What will you do now?" "After all this, stay," Jed said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "This land, it belongs to these people in a way. I'll tend their graves, make sure they're remembered. Build something here that honors them rather than hiding them." "That's good," Ruth said. "They deserve that. And so do you, a place to finally rest after all your wandering. What about you?" "I don't know yet. My family's property will be seized, reputation destroyed. I'll have to start over with nothing." She smiled slightly. "But nothing feels lighter than everything did. If that makes sense." It does. They stood together in silence, watching as the work continued. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. The barn was gone, but in its absence, truth had emerged. Justice, delayed by 16 years and 3 generations, had finally arrived. It wasn't perfect. Many of the guilty were dead, beyond earthly punishment. The damage done couldn't be undone. Families had been destroyed, lives ended, futures stolen. No amount of justice could restore what was lost, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was memory. It was the absolute refusal to let evil succeed through silence. That night, as Jed lay in his bedroll under the stars, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the peace of a battle won, but the peace of a purpose fulfilled. He'd come to this valley seeking solitude and escape. Instead, he'd found connection to his past and responsibility to the dead. His father's ghost was quieter now, its burden shared and lightened. Marcus Crowe could rest, knowing his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. And Jed himself, weathered, scarred, worn down by years of wandering, had finally found a reason to stay in one place. Tomorrow would bring more work. More excavation, more documentation, more painful truths unearthed. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, with the mountains standing eternal and the creek singing its endless song, Jedediah Crowe slept the sleep of the just. The barn was gone. The truth remained, and that in the end was all that mattered. The final confrontation Jed had prepared for never came in the form of violence. Instead, it came on a cold December morning when the last of the conspirators stood before the gathered town to answer for their silence. The citizens of Coldwater. Ridge had called a public meeting in the church, the same church that had served as sanctuary during the conflict. Federal Marshal Thornton was present, along with a territorial judge, who'd come specifically to oversee what the newspapers were calling the final reckoning. Standing at the front of the church were 15 people, not the obvious conspirators who'd already been convicted, but others. Shopkeepers, farmers, respected citizens who'd known the truth for years or suspected it and said nothing. They'd gathered voluntarily, prompted by conscience or Clara Whitmore's relentless documentation of who knew what and when. Tom Mackey, the general store owner, spoke first. His voice shook, but he stood straight, I knew. Not everything, but enough. My grandfather told me stories before he died about the trouble in '67, about families that disappeared. He said they'd moved on, but the way he said it, I knew he was lying. I never asked questions, never pushed. Just ran my store and took people's money and pretended everything was fine. He looked at the graves visible through the window. I'm sorry. That's not enough, but it's all I have. Others followed one by one. A rancher who'd heard rumors and ignored them. A teacher who'd noticed gaps in town records and decided not to investigate. A former deputy who'd been told to look the other way when questions arose. Each confession was painful, each admission of cowardice or complacency adding another layer to the truth. Marshal Thornton listened to all of them, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he stood. The law distinguishes between active conspiracy and passive knowledge. Most of you aren't guilty of crimes I can prosecute, but you are guilty of something, of moral cowardice, of choosing comfort over truth. He paused, letting the words sink in. The question now is what you do with that knowledge, how you rebuild from here. The territorial judge, an older man named Harrison, who'd seen the frontier grow from wilderness to civilization, added his voice. A town is more than buildings and businesses. It's a community built on shared values. Your values were tested 16 years ago, and you failed that test. Every day since, you've had the chance to correct that failure, and you chose not to. Now the correction has been forced upon you. He looked around the packed church, making eye contact with as many as he could. Some of you will leave. That's your right. But for those who stay, understand this. You're building a new town now. One with a terrible history that must be acknowledged and honored. That cemetery isn't a shame to hide. It's a reminder of what happens when greed overcomes morality, when silence protects evil. Clara Whitmore stood then, her small frame somehow commanding the room's attention. I've documented everything. Every name, every crime, every act of courage and cowardice. It will be published in newspapers, in historical records, in books. Your children and grandchildren will know what happened here. You can't bury this anymore. The only choice you have is whether you face it honestly or spend the rest of your lives running from it. There was a long silence. Then a woman stood, Mrs. Anders, whose husband had been a deputy during the massacre. My children asked me about the cemetery, about why there are so many graves of people who died on the same day. What do I tell them? The truth, Jed said, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to him. You tell them what happened. You tell them that sometimes people do terrible things for bad reasons, and you tell them that their job is to be better, to stand up when they see wrong, to speak out when others stay silent, to be the kind of people who make different choices. My husband was part of it, Mrs. Anders said, tears streaming down her face. He helped bury the bodies. He took money afterward, blood money. We lived on that money. My children were raised on it. That's your husband's sin, not theirs, Ruth said gently. And yours only if you keep hiding it. Tell them the truth. Give them the chance to be better than their father was. The meeting continued for hours, voices raised in argument and reconciliation, grief and determination. By the end, a consensus had emerged. Those who stayed would dedicate themselves to maintaining the cemetery and teaching the truth. An annual memorial service would be held. The town's history would be taught in schools without embellishment or excuse. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem what had been done. But it was acknowledgement. And from acknowledgement could come something like healing. As people filed out of the church, Deputy Collins approached Jed. The young man had been appointed acting sheriff by Marshal Thornton. a temporary position that might become permanent if he proved capable. Sir, I wanted to thank you for showing me what real courage looks like, for teaching me that sometimes following orders is the wrong thing to do. You figured that out yourself, Jed said. I just gave you the opportunity. Still, I won't forget it. Collins hesitated. I've been going through the old records. There are other cases. People who disappeared over the years. Deaths that were called accidents, but might not have been. I think there's more to uncover. Then uncover it. Truth doesn't stop being important just because the big crime is exposed. Every victim deserves justice, even if it's only the justice of being remembered. Collins nodded and left, already planning his investigation. Jed watched him go, feeling something like hope. The young sheriff would make mistakes, but he'd make them honestly. That was better than perfection achieved through lies. The winter deepened, and with it came hard work. Jed and Ruth, with help from Doc Harlan and others, built a solid cabin near the cemetery. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was honest work producing an honest home. They worked in companionable silence most days, both comfortable with quiet after months of chaos. One evening, as they sat by the fire with snow falling outside, Ruth asked the question that had been hanging between them. What are we to each other, Jed? Partners? Friends? Something more? Jed considered his answer carefully. I'm 54 years old. Been alone most of my life by choice. Lost my wife and daughter years back. Never thought I'd want that kind of connection again. But then I met you, and you showed me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about being terrified and standing anyway. That's not an answer to my question. I know. He took her hand. I'm not good with words, Ruth. Never have been. But I know I want you in my life. However, you're willing to be there. Ruth smiled, the expression transforming her face. I want more than companionship, Jed. I want partnership. Maybe love eventually. Is that something you can offer? I think so. I'm out of practice, but yes, I'd like to try. They sat together, watching the fire, and for the first time in decades, Jed felt something beyond contentment. He felt hope for a future that included more than just survival. The cemetery grew throughout the winter. More family members of the victims were located, and they came to pay their respects. Some stayed, adding their voices to the growing memorial. Others left, but promised to return for the annual service Clara was organizing. On the anniversary of the massacre, August 24th, the entire territory seemed to converge on Coldwater Ridge. Families of victims, journalists, politicians, and curious citizens filled the town beyond capacity. Judge Thompson came, as did Marshal Thornton. Even the territorial governor made an appearance, though his presence was more political calculation than genuine respect. The memorial service was held at the cemetery, with speeches and prayers and the reading of every name. When it came time for family members to speak, an old woman stepped forward, Emily Thomas, sister of Samuel Thomas, who'd been killed along with his wife and children. I was 16 when it happened, she said, her voice strong despite her age. My brother wrote me letters about his new home, about the land he was clearing and the life he was building. Then the letters stopped. I always wondered what happened. Now I know. She looked at the headstone bearing her brother's family's names. Thank you for giving me answers, for giving us all the truth, even though it came so late. Others spoke, descendants, relatives, people connected by blood or memory to the victims. Each story added texture to the historical facts, transforming numbers into people. 53 wasn't just a statistic. It was Samuel Thomas and his family. It was the Rodriguez children. It was Marcus Crowe and his dreams of peace after war. When Jed was asked to speak, he kept it brief. I'm not good with speeches, but I want to say this. Truth matters. Justice matters. And memory matters most of all. These people didn't die for nothing. They died because they stood for something, and because evil men wanted what they had. We honor them not by forgetting or excusing what happened, but by remembering it completely and honestly. By being the kind of people who would have stood with them rather than against them. He stepped back, and Ruth squeezed his hand. The service continued, but Jed's attention drifted to the mountains surrounding them. The same mountains Marcus Crowe had seen, had thought beautiful enough to build a life beneath. The same mountains that had witnessed murder and stood silent for 16 years. But mountains kept their secrets only until someone was brave enough to dig them out. And once exposed, truth had a way of spreading, of demanding acknowledgement, of refusing to be buried again. As the sun set and people began to disperse, Jed found himself alone at his ancestor's grave. He placed his hand on the stone, feeling the carved letters of Marcus's name. "I did what I could," he said quietly. "I told your story, made sure you were remembered, brought the people responsible to justice as much as was possible. I hope that's enough. I hope you can rest now." The wind whispered through the pines, and Jed chose to hear it as answer, as acceptance, as peace finally granted. He walked back to his cabin where Ruth waited, where a fire burned bright against the darkening evening. Behind him, 53 graves stood witness to the truth that had nearly been lost but was finally, permanently preserved. The barn that had started everything was gone, burned to ashes, and cleared away. But in its place stood something better, a memorial, a cemetery, a promise that some sins would not be forgotten, some victims would not go unremembered, some truths would not stay buried forever, and watching over it all, ensuring that promise was kept, stood Jedediah Crowe, no longer a drifter, no longer running from his past, but finally, truly home. 3 years passed like water over stone, slowly shaping everything, changing the landscape in ways both subtle and profound. The cemetery had grown into something more than just graves. Clara Whitmore, with federal funding and private donations, had established a small museum in a building constructed at the site's edge. It housed the original documents, Marcus Crowe's journal, the medical report, Lieutenant James Crowe's suppressed military investigation, and Ruth's family papers, all preserved behind glass, available for anyone who wanted to understand what had happened here and why it mattered. Jed had donated his father's medallion to the collection. It sat in a place of honor, with a placard explaining its significance. This medallion belonged to Lieutenant James Crowe, who investigated the massacre and attempted to bring the perpetrators to justice. His suppressed report, hidden for 16 years, ultimately helped expose the truth. The medallion was left by Lieutenant Crowe in a gorge near the massacre site, perhaps hoping someone would find it and finish what he could not. The cabin Jed and Ruth built had become a home in the truest sense. Ruth tended a garden that bloomed defiantly against the mountain cold, coaxing vegetables and flowers from soil that had once covered graves. Jed maintained the cemetery grounds, ensuring the grass was cut, the stones cleaned, and the paths clear for the steady stream of visitors who came to pay respects or learn history. They'd married the previous spring in a simple ceremony at the church, with Doc Harlan officiating, since the previous minister had been among those who left in shame. Colin served as best man, Clara as matron of honor. It was a small gathering of people who understood that sometimes the best marriages are built not on romance, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. Coldwater Ridge had transformed as well. Half the town's original families had left, unable to bear the weight of association with the massacre. New people had come, honest folk drawn by cheap land and the promise of starting fresh. The town that emerged was smaller but healthier, built on truth rather than lies. Sheriff Collins had proven himself capable and honest, investigating old cases and bringing closure to families who'd lost loved ones to the conspiracy's violence. He'd even married a school teacher from Denver who'd come to teach at the new school, one that included the full history of the massacre in its curriculum. Doc Harlan had passed away peacefully the previous winter, his conscience finally at rest. His last words to Jed were simple: "Thank you for letting me make it right." He was buried near the cemetery, his headstone noting his role in exposing the truth. On this particular morning, 3 years to the day since Jed had first opened that barn door, he stood at Marcus Crowe's grave, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Ruth had prepared a special breakfast to mark the anniversary, but Jed had needed these few moments alone first. "Morning, Marcus," he said quietly, as had become his habit. 3 years now, Thought you should know what's become of this place. He told the stone about the museum, about the visitors who came from across the territory and beyond to learn and remember. About the children who played in the cemetery's edges, raised to see it not as a place of horror, but as a reminder of why truth matters. About how the town had rebuilt itself on honesty rather than profit. I've been thinking about what Doc said before he died. About forgiveness. Jed's voice was thoughtful. Not forgiving the people who killed you. Some things can't and shouldn't be forgiven. But forgiving the ones who stayed silent out of fear. The Tom Mackeys and Mrs. Anders of the world. People who weren't evil, just weak. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I think you'd understand that. You were a soldier. You knew the difference between the man who pulls the trigger and the man who looks away. Both are wrong, but they're not the same kind of wrong. A breeze stirred the pines, carrying the scent of mountain morning and Ruth's cooking. Jed smiled slightly. Ruth's calling me to breakfast. She sends her regards, by the way. Says to tell you she's sorry for what her family did, but she's proud of what you stood for. She lives that pride every day, trying to be worthy of the land you died defending. He touched the stone once more, feeling the sun-warmed granite. I found my place here, Marcus. Found my purpose. Thought you should know your sacrifice wasn't for nothing. You stood firm, and 16 years later your stand still mattered, still changed things. That's as close to immortality as any of us gets. Jed walked back to the cabin, where Ruth waited at the door, her smile warming him more than any sunrise. They ate breakfast together on the porch, watching visitors begin to arrive at the cemetery, a school group from Cheyenne, a family of descendants, a historian from back east working on a book. Do you ever regret it? Ruth asked, pouring coffee. All of this? You came here seeking peace and quiet, and instead you got violence and notoriety. I found something better than peace, Jed said. I found purpose, meaning, and I found you. Hard to regret any of that. Even the being shot at and nearly burned alive parts? Even those. He sipped his coffee, watching the morning unfold. My father spent his life regretting what he couldn't do. I get to spend mine knowing I did what I could. That's worth more than all the quiet peace in the world. Later that morning, an unexpected visitor arrived. A young man, perhaps 25, who approached the cabin with visible nervousness. He removed his hat respectfully and introduced himself. Mr. Crowe, my name is Daniel Pritchard. Samuel Pritchard was my grandfather. Jed studied him, seeing the family resemblance, but also seeing something different in the young man's eyes. Not the calculation of his grandfather, but genuine remorse. What can I do for you, Mr. Pritchard? I wanted to apologize in person for what my family did, both in 1867 and 3 years ago. I was away at university when everything happened. When I came home and learned the truth, He struggled for words. I was ashamed. Am ashamed. My grandfather is in prison. Our family name is ruined. And all I can think is that we deserved it. That's a heavy burden for a young man, Ruth said gently. It's the burden I inherited. The question is what I do with it. Daniel looked at the cemetery, at the neat rows of stones. I'm a lawyer now. Finished my studies. I want to specialize in land rights and historical justice. To help other families like these. People whose land was stolen, whose stories were buried. I can't undo what my family did, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen to others. Jed exchanged a glance with Ruth, then nodded slowly. That's good work. Important work. Your grandfather helped bury the truth. You're choosing to dig it out elsewhere. That's the right way to carry his legacy. Will you... Daniel hesitated. Will you write me a letter of reference? To the territorial bar? Having your endorsement would mean a great deal. I'll do better than that, Jed said. I'll tell them you're the kind of man who faces hard truths instead of running from them. That you understand the difference between inheriting guilt and accepting responsibility. That's the highest praise I can give anyone. Daniel's eyes shone with gratitude. Thank you, sir. I'll try to be worthy of it. After he left, Ruth slipped her arm through Jed's. You're a good man. Jedediah Crowe, giving that young man a chance when you had every right to turn him away. Sins don't pass through blood, Jed said. He's not responsible for what his grandfather did, but he is responsible for what he does with that knowledge. Looks to me like he's making the right choice. The afternoon brought more visitors, descendants of other victim families, people who'd read about the massacre in newspapers or history books, students writing papers about frontier justice. Jed and Ruth welcomed them all, answered their questions, directed them to Clara's museum for more detailed information. As sunset approached, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the crowds thinned until only one figure remained, Sheriff Collins, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself. "Evening, Jed, Ruth," he nodded to them both. "Thought I'd pay my respects before heading home." They walked to the cemetery together, Collins placing his flowers at the base of the central monument. The three of them stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. "I arrested a man today," Collins said finally, "for murdering a claim jumper back in '79. Been covering it up for years, telling everyone the fellow just moved on. But I found evidence, letters, witness statements. Brought him in. Justice delayed," Ruth said, "but not denied. Not anymore." Collins looked at Jed. "You taught me that it's never too late to do the right thing, that the law means nothing if we don't have the courage to enforce it honestly." "You taught yourself that," Jed said. "I just opened a door. You chose to walk through it." After Collins left, Jed and Ruth remained, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars Marcus Crowe had seen, the same stars that had watched over the massacre and its long aftermath. But now they looked down on something different. Not hidden evil, but acknowledged truth. Not buried shame, but honored memory. "Do you think they're at peace now?" Ruth asked quietly. "The ones buried here?" "I think peace is for the living," Jed said. "The dead are beyond our help or harm. What matters is that we remember them honestly, honor them completely, and learn from what happened to them." And have we learned? Some have. Others never will. But enough have learned that it makes a difference. That's all we can ask for. They walked back to their cabin as full night fell, their home warm with lamplight and the promise of supper. Behind them, the cemetery stood quiet under the stars, its stones marking not just death, but the triumph of truth over lies, of courage over cowardice, of memory over forgetting. The barn was long gone, its ashes scattered by wind and rain. But what it had hidden, what it had tried to keep buried, now stood in permanent testimony. 53 names carved in stone, their stories told in Clara's museum, their sacrifice remembered by a town that had finally learned the cost of silence. And watching over it all, ensuring that the truth never again fell into darkness, were the unlikely guardians who'd fought to bring it to light. A weathered mountain man who'd come seeking peace and found purpose. A woman who'd betrayed her family's interests for the sake of her own integrity. A young sheriff learning that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied. As Jed settled into his chair by the fire that night, Ruth reading beside him, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Contentment not from absence of struggle, but from knowing he'd struggled for something that mattered. His father had carried the weight of undone justice to his grave. Marcus Crowe had died trying to defend what was right. 53 souls had been murdered for standing firm. But their sacrifices hadn't been meaningless. The truth they'd died, for that his father had been broken by, had finally emerged. And emerging, it had changed things. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Sometimes, Jed reflected, that's all any of us can hope for. To see our struggles matter. To know our stands count for something. To leave the world a little more honest than we found it. The barn that had stood over those graves for 16 years had been meant as a marker warning people away. Stay away from there. Don't ask questions. Don't dig for truth. But warnings like that only work on the weak and the complacent. For those willing to open doors, to face uncomfortable truths, to stand for what's right regardless of cost, those warnings become invitations. Invitations to uncover, to expose, to remember, invitations to justice. Jed closed his eyes, listening to the fire crackle and Ruth's quiet breathing beside him. Tomorrow would bring more work. the cemetery to tend, visitors to welcome, truths to preserve. But tomorrow could wait. Tonight, in this cabin he'd built with his own hands on land redeemed through courage, Jedediah Crowe was finally, completely home. The barn was gone. The truth remained, and that, in the end, was all that mattered.